First time for me as well. No, well, there's only been two, and I was in I'm one of those coworkers. Usually one of my life around just has to take care of it. 7. It's awesome. We'll probably wait a couple more minutes for. So basically, nobody has tag manager experience here. Which is good. I don't really have any slides or anything like that. What it does in the first. That is exactly my reads. Yeah. Peter went to sleep. Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Not a huge crowd tonight, but that's okay. That just means there's a lot more opportunity for questions and to kind of tailor it to you all's skill level. I don't have any slides. It's kind of a non-traditional presentation, but it's really just to kind of go over Google Tag Manager, kind of what it is, some of the basics of Google Tag Manager, as well as some of the more a few advanced things that you can do that I've kind of found through the several years that I've been working with it. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Terry Hale. I'm the Senior Web Development Manager for Big Wing Interactive, and then I also freelance and have my own business called Ceniac, which is CENIACK. So who has any experience with Tag Manager here? Anybody? You do? Awesome. What do you use it for normally? Okay. Okay, awesome. So where I'm at right now, this is kind of a default container that I created that's just basic page view tracking. So one of the most basic things you can do within Google Analytics is page view tracking. Actually, let me step back. What Tag Manager really is the best way to think of it is basically like a content management system for all of your tagging on a website. So whether that's double-click floodlight tags, it can be Facebook pixels, Google Analytics tags, all of that stuff can live within Google Tag Manager. And there's four primary components to it. There's the tags themselves, and what those do is that's just executing a function, more often than not, it's sending data to a third-party system, whether that be Google Analytics, Facebook, LinkedIn, analytics, that type of thing. Then there's also triggers, and the triggers, what those are, is that's basically just like it sounds. It's what triggers the tag to fire off, and that's usually based on a condition. So it's just it basically returns like true, false, and it's based off of a condition that's stored in variables. And the variables are basically just pieces of data that you can use as conditionals for firing triggers and as data to send through in tags. Then the fourth piece that you don't actually see here is called the data layer, and it's basically just a JavaScript object that Google Tag Manager sets up by default that allows you that all this information gets stored in. So I'll go ahead and kind of get started here with tags. So when you want to set up a basic page view tag, really any kind of tag, what you want to do is you want to create a tag. What I've done here is created a universal analytics tag. You can see over here there are actually tons of different templates that are available. You have your universal analytics, which is what you should be using by default, especially on any new website. You have your AdWords. You can also do custom HTML tags. This is useful for a lot of different purposes. You can use it to add functionality into the site to make tags work. So there's several different pieces of custom HTML that I put in some of the containers to do certain types of things, whether that's fire off a custom event that I then use to fire off tags. You can also use it to display information on the website. You have to be really careful with the custom HTML because you are running arbitrary code on a website. I've actually heard it kind of put it one way, is it's basically a cross-site scripting as a service, because you can do a lot with that HTML tag. So you really want to be careful with who you allow into your Google Tag Manager container, and then what you're putting in there, because you could really mess up a site if you're not careful. The front end of the site, more than likely you won't mess up the back end. A lot of other tags, they've added a ton. They're always adding new tags and templates. So for a basic page view tag, you'd select your your universal analytics. You can set up your different track types. So they already have some that are built into here. They have event, transaction, social, timing, and decorated links. What we're primarily going to talk about are page view and event tracking. Then you also have what's really nice that they've recently added is a Google Analytics setting variable that you can set. And if you haven't set one of those, you can also override specific pieces of functionality in there. So what this allows you to do is, send custom dimensions with your Google Analytics hit. And whenever you're using that Google Analytics settings variable, you can use that across all of your Google Analytics tags. So that way you don't have to go in and set up each tag individually, which was a bit of a nightmare to keep track of all that, especially if you're sending, 3, 4, 5 custom dimensions, any custom metrics, content groupings, those types of things. So it's really nice that you don't have to to worry about that anymore with that. And you can also have multiple Google Analytics settings variables. So if you want to send certain information with page views and certain and other information with analytics hits, you can do that as well. So what you want to do is set your universal analytics, set your settings variable if you haven't already, or override those settings. And then you want to set up a trigger. For your page views, more than likely, you're going to set those to fire on all page views. You can also add exceptions. So if you wanted to make it where it only fired on certain types of page views and not on certain other types, you can do that as well. So to add the trigger, you would just click there, save. And so now we've basically got a page view firing. Now we haven't touched really any of the variables other than the Google Analytics settings variable. And what you'll want to do is preview this. So it's got a really nice preview functionality. So you can use that to help troubleshoot your tags and your tracking. And then when you refresh, oh, I'm sorry. I forgot I have the wrong container set up live on this one. Let me go to default. Give me 1 second, sorry. Having some technical difficulties here. Let's see what the problem is. I have the wrong ID in there. Give me a couple seconds. I'll get that fixed. Okay, for some reason their debug bar is not working. Well, I apologize. So I'll just go skip straight to our advanced container. There we go. So you'll get in this nice debug bar. Now there's a lot of stuff on here that I haven't shown you yet, but what you really want to see is this UA page view tag. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, this is all of the events that have hit, that have fired off in that container. Most of these are default, so your page view tag or event that always fires off, your DOM ready, your window loaded, and those allow you to basically fire off different tags based off of those events. So next what you can do is if you want to see what information is getting sent with that page view tag, you can click under tags, click the tag. And as you can see, here's all of the JavaScript, or all of the information that's getting sent with that. And you can also see what triggers are causing that to fire off. You can see I'm actually sending some custom dimensions as well. Oops. The other great thing is you can also see all of your variables that you have. So if you want to see what variables that maybe you're not sending data with on that particular hit, you can actually go in and look at all of those different variables as well to see what information is being sent with that, or that are active. And then you have the infamous data layer that I spoke about earlier. Now on this one, since it's just a page view, the data layer is actually relatively small. There are some other pieces of information that I actually pushed whenever the site was live. Or I'm sorry, whenever the page was loaded, basically created a sample data layer with the category, author, and ID, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So So for some of the more advanced tracking that you want to set up, you want to get really familiar with the data layer. So as you can see on here, this is basically the page template that I'm pulling information in. You can see up here where there's this object that I've set, a JavaScript object that has data layer equals, and then the container there. And what you can do is you can actually use, there's two different ways that you can push information into the data layer. One is actually setting it up before you actually set the tag up, or before you add the container. So that way it's available to the tags before they fire. So if you wanted to only fire a certain tag on a certain page category, you could set that there and set that as a conditional for that tag to fire. The other thing that you can do is also set it up based off of what they call a data layer push. And so an example of that would be on the contact us section here that I've created. You can see this on-click event here that's based off of using JavaScript that basically does a data layer push, and this is for a contact form here. So what you always have to do though if you're doing a push is you always have to have an event key, the event name, and then the information that you want to send there. And you can send as much or as little information as you want, and you don't even necessarily have to use it all. But as you can see here, we have a few different pieces of information. We have DL event category, DL event action, DL event label, and those are the data layer keys. So whenever you're actually setting up your container, and you can access those basically with a variable. So you can see here there's all of these different variables here. What you'd want to do to be able to access that information is just create a new variable, variable configuration, and you would actually select a where's the data layer variable? There we go. A data layer variable, and then you give it that variable's name. And so now anytime that is pushed in, that'll be available now in your tag manager whenever to send that information in. And what it is it'll be populated with the value of that data layer push for that particular key. So if I go back to our page here, this was set up on the contact form. So if I just wanted to put in some random, this isn't a working form, it's just for, so it doesn't go anywhere, so you'll see the page refresh. I'm actually going to command click to have that fire off so that way I don't lose that information here. But you can see over here, there's that form submit event that showed up right here that coincides with that event here that says form submit. Now I don't have any tags set to fire off on this yet, but if you click over to your variables, you can actually see the data layer variable for, where'd it go? I don't know why it's not showing up on there because it's in the data layer here. Let me make sure I didn't accidentally save it at the wrong name. Oh, actually I know exactly why I didn't do that. I forgot to hit refresh on my preview. So let me try that again. Hit send. Sorry, I forgot to command click on that one. Send it. So if I go back over here, now you can see form submit. Nothing was fired on here, but you should see now over here that DL event category. And you can see it has the value for that particular event that I set over there. So the data layer is really powerful because you can use that for anything as far as data that you want to send over. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. Is this all useful information, or is this stuff that those who have used it kind of have seen before? No problem. So the next thing I want to show you is some of the other different tags that I've actually set up. So one of the things that can get a little bit confusing is, this is all well and good to have a tag manager working. What does that mean for my analytics? What kind of things would I want to do? So one of the things that we've done that I find the most useful is setting up tracking for where on a page specific actions are happening. One of the most common things is things like link clicks and that type of thing. So what you can do on here is excuse me. I've set up some different custom HTML code on the site through an HTML tag that actually adds some additional functionality that's not normally there. So normally if you want to get information as far as, I want to get this link click, you actually have to go through, you have to create a tag. It'd be universal analytics, it'd be an event tag, and you'll have all your category, action, and labels. Now, if you want to get a lot of different information, but you don't want to have to set all of this up individually, one of the things that you can actually do is create a JavaScript listener and some event handlers. And what those allow you to do is add some custom HTML data attributes to the website that will then allow you to track that different pieces of information. So for example, on the header area, you can actually add a custom data attribute around the entire header. You can also add individual data attributes around individual links or sections of the site. So for example, if you wanted to track any kind of a link click inside of the header there, oops. What you would do is you would go under your code on your site. And I can share some of the code that actually makes this work. You can see here I have this data BWGTM component equals contact info, or I'm sorry, on the header that would be data BWGTM component equals header navigation, and then this data BWGTM event click. What that actually does is this just lets me know that I'm wanting to track clicks inside of anything that's inside of that navigation, element. So what that looks like in practice is if you're on this site, so this is the one that has our more advanced tracking container on there. I want to click on contact. So you can see over here, it fired off this BW track event, which is handled by some of the custom JavaScript code that's on there. And then it fires off this event here. That's the UA link click internal. And it sends you a category, action, and label. So what it did is it set that category as a header navigation. Since it knew I was tracking link clicks, it fired off this link click internal. And then it gave the label which would be the text of the link that was clicked, so whatever text was there, as well as the URL of where that actually ended up going to. And then I've added a custom delimiter as well for 2 semicolons, just because there's not really a whole lot else in the web world that would use 2 semicolons like that back to back, so it gives you a really good delimiter that you can use if you're needing to do like text to columns or something like that. Now I'll kind of show you exactly how that was set up in here. So what I've done is I've created there's these 3 different custom HTML variables. There's this one that's some tracking libraries. Those are some off-the-shelf libraries. I can share a link to what those are with anybody that would like to see those. Then there's an event handler here. So this is where some of the magic happens. So you can see for the click delegate where it's looking for that event click. There's also some extra ones that I've added in here that I'm not going to demo today, but for getting hover intent. So if somebody's hovering over a button but doesn't actually click on it, you can actually fire that information off that they hovered over the button. And then for the data BWGTM event appear, that's if something scrolls into view on the site, which has actually been kind of made redundant with some features that Google Tag Manager has added recently to do scroll tracking. Then I have this is the actual Google Analytics tag here, which is the BW track event tag. And as you can see here, here's the configuration for it. So you can see the category, action, and label are actually being populated by data layer variables that are fired off by the this track event function. So as you can see down here, it does a data layer push for the event, and then it grabs the category, which is the component, the action, the label, and then I also have it getting the some other HTML attributes for the URL, image URL, or alt text. So that way, if you happen to have an image, like say the logo on a site, and it does not have text that you can grab, you can at least grab the alt text if you have the alt text on there, or any other kind of information that might be available there. Then you have a trigger, which is for the event BW track event. And so what this does is it basically fires off on that BW track event, which if I go back over to here, you can see in the left-hand side, that's that BW track event. So anytime that shows up, it will fire off that tag. So long as the category is not set and the action does not contain click. So that one basically gets everything other than the link clicks. If you want to see the link click ones for internal, here's the check for that. So it checks to make sure that the link is internal with the table, and I can show that in a moment. And of course, it makes sure that the action equals click, the category isn't not set, that it's an actual URL, because a lot of times some developers will create links that aren't actually like a URL for different JavaScript actions and things like that. And then there were some other things in here that I had for some conditionals for an actual site that I was working on. And kind of going back, so for the internal link click, if you wanted, one of the most powerful variables that you can use in Tag Manager is actually the table variable. And what that allows you to do is basically take one piece of input, take that value, and then depending on what that value is, you set it with you can set a different output. And so this one's a little bit complicated because it's chaining multiple variables together. So that's one of the cool things about the variables, is you can actually use variables to populate other variables as conditionals. So what this is actually doing is it's taking the click URL host name, which in this example is localhost, since the website's running on my local machine. And then if that input matches the same as the page URL host name, it'll fire off an output as an internal, and then it has a default for outbound. And then that's referenced in these two triggers and this other variable. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually using this to build an output for that, where you saw the link click internal or link click outbound. I'm using variables to build that dynamically, so you don't have to create a ton of variables for each specific instance. You can actually use something like a lookup table to populate another variable that then populates a tag or a trigger, so that way you don't have to create a bunch of different variables for every single instance. And by default, that makes it so you don't have to create a separate tag for every single thing that you want to track. I've also used the tables for looking up the Google Analytics ID. So whenever you're working between different types of websites, so if you're working locally versus staging versus development, you can actually have your input variable be the page host name. And then you can set, based off of, since this is local, I don't have a bunch of other stuff on there, but you can have one for, so if that page host name was staging.com, you could have it output a completely different ID. So that way you don't pollute your live analytics with test data from your testing sites. That came in very handy a few times in a few projects I've worked on. because you don't want to, it's really difficult to maintain multiple containers for a website. And then you also have no idea if your analytics team and whoever's doing the development on a site are separate, which is the case at a lot of places. You don't have to worry about there being a breakdown in communication and where they push a website live or they're working on it separately, and then all of a sudden you're getting random polluted data in your analytics. Oops, I'm going to go ahead and discard those. Another really useful variable is the auto event variable. So it kind of does some of the similar type of thing that I was showing you. So if you don't want to get into adding custom JavaScript libraries and all that kind of stuff into your GTM container, what you can do is use what they call an auto event variable. And what that actually does is it allows you to grab those attributes off of a specific element in the HTML. So you can grab an element attribute, so you can use a custom attribute. You can grab the value from a class, an ID, target, URL, all those different things. So this one I'm actually using an element attribute. And then on here I'm doing data BW GTM component. Now one of the things about that is it doesn't propagate up. So in the example that I showed you where I had this data BW GTM component, anything that's clicked on within there that's an actual link will fire off a tag. If you're wanting to just use those auto event variables, you would actually have to add that component to each of the links that you wanted to track, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You just have to go through and have your developers add that, or add it yourself, and you wouldn't have to worry about the event click. But I can kind of show you what that looks like in practice. I'll go ahead and add this to this element here. Save it. Give it a second to update. So if I go to about, whoops. Actually, I'll grab it on the link click, variables. So you can see there that AE data BW GTM component equals header navigation. So that's a less complex way to set that up. One thing I do recommend though is if you are going to set up tracking is to try not to base it off of class names or IDs, because what happens is with your HTML classes or your CSS classes and IDs, those are generally used for, classes are a lot of times used for styling. And so you might have somebody they're wanting to change up the look of a button or something like that, and they change the class name. If your tracking is set up on that class name, it's now broken. So I really recommend if you're going to set up tracking to try not to use the class names whenever possible. Now sometimes that's not possible and you have to use the class names because you don't have access to the development team to add those custom data attributes to the site for you. And that's really, there's really a lot that you can cover within Google Tag Manager. I've probably spent about the better part of 2 years trying to learn it, and there's still a lot that I don't know, and that I'm learning about it. And they're adding new features and functionality all the time. So a lot of it I haven't even been able to explore fully yet. Any questions? What does the data look like? The data look like? Good question. So since that was the advanced one, so I'll go to behavior. Hopefully it'll have some of the events showing up in there. So if I go to top events and change my date range for today. So you can see in here, so that contact form block, so that's the event category that was set. We're here where it's header navigation. There's your link click internal. And then there's the actual URLs that were clicked. Now I did add, actually one other thing I can actually show you all, is I've actually added some extra pieces of functionality inside of the Tag Manager container that allow me to get some other pieces of information. So normally if you want to get session level, I believe it's, Jessica would actually be able to explain this a lot better than I can, but basically there's a lot of information you can't get in bulk unless you have Google Analytics Premium. So Google Analytics without Premium, I think you're limited to 7 custom dimensions in a report. So if you want to get a report that has all of your custom dimensions that you fired off, you actually have to stitch that data together. And so a couple of tags that are in here actually are this window loaded with valid client ID. And what that is actually doing is grabbing the client ID that Google Analytics assigns to a specific, it's not really the user because it's separate. So like if I were to open up Firefox on my browser and do this, I'd have a completely separate client ID inside of Google Analytics. And so what I've done is created a custom JavaScript variable that grabs the client ID. And so all this is doing is it's using the, again, you see the kind of a recurring theme there. It's calling another variable, even inside of the JavaScript. So what that's doing is it's grabbing the client ID, or the Google Analytics ID for that property, and then it's whenever an action happens, it basically grabs that client ID and passes it as a custom dimension into Google Analytics. Then I also have, and there's probably a much better way to do this. I've actually been working on a better way so it's not as resource intensive, but I also have it generating a custom session ID that gets appended also as a custom dimension. In addition, I'm sending basically a timestamp with the user's local offset. So it's basically UTC minus, so like if it was Central, I think it's like 12 a.m. It's like -5 or -6. I can't remember. Depends on if it's daylight savings time. But it'll send basically what their time zone is whenever. So you can use that to tell whenever people are on the site. And so kind of what that ends up looking like inside of Google Analytics is now if I want to pull up a second dimension of client ID, there's my client ID. And so what's really great about this is and then if I want to see what my session ID, because what I did is set up the session ID as a session scoped dimension. So this is kind of going into setting up analytics a little bit. But if you go into your custom dimensions here, you can see I have client ID, session ID, hit timestamp, and then another one that I've set up that's called the exit page time. So you can see the client ID and session ID I've done as session scoped. Client ID, you could actually probably do it as a user scope dimension, but I tend to do it as a session scope just because more for the visitors, like people coming to the site's privacy than anything. If they don't clear their cookies out or anything like that, make it session scope so that way if they don't clear them out, the next time they come back, it'll still have the same client ID. And then, so I'll show you that in the, where that really comes in handy now is, let me go to create a custom report really quick, is you can add those in as custom reports. So if I wanted to add client ID, and I will actually do it as a flat table, client ID, session ID. So now you actually have 2 keys that you can pull in basically with any, so what I would usually recommend is pulling a report that has a client ID, session ID, and then just probably just page views as a metric. And then what that allows you to do is now you have a key and value pair. So like if you want to start stitching stuff together later on, you can actually do that. So I'd pull a report that has this information to get your client ID and session ID. And really from now on, if you want to pull a custom report and you want to start stitching things together, you can now create another custom report that has just the session ID. and you can use that to link it back to the client ID. So you could pull the session ID and XYZ custom dimensions or page views or anything like that. And that gives you a way where you can basically get all of your custom dimensions out of Google, or all of your dimensions and metrics out of Google Analytics and stitch them together without actually having to pay for Google Analytics Premium, which is like $100,000 a year. So it's pretty beneficial. It also gives you a lot of interesting opportunities for doing other custom data visualizations and things like that as well, if you're into that. So if we go back to the custom report and edit it. See, I'll add page path. Actually, I'll do events. Event category. Action. Label. Going to go ahead and get rid of the client ID. And I'll do total events, I think, and then hit timestamp. So now what you're seeing here now is, if you order it by the hit timestamp, you are now seeing basically the timing of my visit on the site, or at least the event. So this doesn't have the page views in there, but you could always stitch that in there. So you can now, if you wanted to build a under the behavior, there's the behavior flow report. Which isn't going to show up for some reason, probably because I just set this up today as far as the information in there. But if you guys have seen, it's basically like a sand key diagram. So say this person, they came in on this page, and then from there they broke out, half of them went to this page, half of them went to this. Well, now you can use that information if you wanted to build your own custom data visualization with that, because then you have an individual client ID for the person, the session, and then you also have what they did. So you can say these users all went this way, these ones all went this way. And since you have the timestamp, you can now kind of start adding all of those together. So it makes it really nice because unless it's changed, it's really difficult to export the data for that user and behavior flow, because you basically can just get it as a PDF and you're kind of stuck with whatever their formatting is. So.
Can you get to the data via API?
Yes. That's the other nice thing that you can do is you can basically grab those custom dimensions and metrics through the API. So if you're using Microsoft Business Intelligence software, yeah, you can pull anything you can get that's been set up. It's using the API calls, or you can grab it using the API, which is really nice. One of the other actual custom data attributes or custom pieces of data that I added on there is, let me go back to my variables. I believe it was in here. Oh yes, this data layer time on page. So I have another piece of code that is actually grabbing, populating the site with the time that they spent on a page. So I have this before unload listener. And so what this is doing is it's firing off an unload event and it's setting how much time was on the page. So one of the things that you can't get usually with Google Analytics normally is how long somebody was on the last page that you visited. Because it uses the delta between the timestamp of when they landed on that page to when they left to go to another page and that hit shows up. So what this actually does is whenever there's an unload event, which is a destructive process, so it's not 100% accurate. So if somebody closes the browser tab or they navigate to a completely different site, what it uses is there's a thing called the beacon that Google Analytics has set up, and it uses that to try and fire off an event even after everything's gotten closed down. So it tries to do it as quick as possible. And so what you can actually do is get how much time they actually spent on that exit page, which is really useful because usually that's probably one of the most valuable pieces of information you'd like to know is how long did somebody spend on that last page that they were on, which you really can't normally get. So and I can pull up in analytics, go back to my custom report. Or actually, I'll go back to,
Can you get, if they type in another website, can you determine where they went?
you can't get where they went, unfortunately, unless you had, analytics on that other site and all that kind of, if it was another site that you were in charge of. But yeah, there's no way to read what people are putting in their browser bar to actually get that. There's a lot of other cool things I've actually played with. So a really good resource if you're wanting to learn more about, this is probably where I've learned 90% of what I've learned, is there's a Samoa Hava has a ridiculous amount of information on Google Tag Manager and its setup. It's a really good blog to read up on. Lunametrics also has a lot of good information. I think that's how you do it. Their blog, there's a ton of information on there as well for setting up tracking and analytics and things like that. Those are probably the resources I've used the most whenever was starting to learn this. One of the things, I can't remember which blog it was on, but it was talking about basically being able to get the browser visibility. And I played around with it a little bit. I don't have a container set up that has it. But one of the things, I don't know if anybody else is like me, where you have a dozen browser tabs open and you're not necessarily looking at any of them. Well, there's actually a JavaScript event that you can hook into that's part of the browser behavior, where you can tell if a browser is active or not. And so you can actually set up another custom dimension that says that'll fire off an event whenever a tab's visible or hidden, and then you can take that information and calculate it to see how much time that browser tab was actually visible, so you can get creative with some of that reporting as well. I guess, is there anything that you guys are interested in seeing that I haven't covered?
Do you even know what to ask? It's all new.
Start with a blank slate on my end.
Yeah, and that's both a scary position to be in, because whenever I started with Tag Manager, I started out with really a blank slate as well. My wife, Jessica, she's kind of the analytics person, so I would always, whenever the way that I ended up getting into this was, I was helping her when she was working at another company, tried to build an analytics reporting tool, so I was kind of doing some of the development side of it, but she was pulling the strings, telling me what all needed to happen. Well, I ended up getting hired by that company, and then I just happened to raise my hand about, oh yeah, I know a little bit of JavaScript and HTML, and so I got stuck doing all of their Google Tag Manager implementations for all of the sites that they were building. And usually I'd have very little time before the site was going to go live before I would even see it, so I was like having to do it like the day the site was going live, so it was a lot of trial by fire. I'm sure I did a lot of stuff wrong, but it was really a good way to learn, is try to find like a real project that you're wanting to do something on, and then just kind of dive in. What I would recommend is if it's like on a live site or something like that, is set up a second Google Analytics account that you just put your stuff from Tag Manager in, leave your normal page view tracking set up the way it is, and just test that way, because then you can get a lot more real information. And if you break the tracking while you're doing it, there's a lot less risk of, you're not going to mess up your data because you're firing stuff to a testing account. And then once you get it fine-tuned and honed, then switch it over to your live account and go from there.
Have you ever done any tracking on a Cordova app?
I have not, but I do know that there is. So, excuse me. There was when you go to create a new container. So if you want to create a container, it does give you the option to create it for either a website, an iOS app, an Android app, or an AMP, like an accelerated mobile page. I have not personally really been able to. I haven't, because I don't do app development in that way. I really haven't gotten to play around with those at all. It's been something I'd be interested in doing. I just haven't actually had a chance to play around with it at all. Another thing too is if any of you all are doing like double click retargeting ads, you probably do when it makes. Is there's actually I don't have an example to be able to show you, but there's a way you can link your double click account to your tag manager container, and you can actually approve tags, so that way you can have somebody that does your display campaigns and everything like that, setting up the tags and pushing them in there, and then you can approve them, so you don't have to give them full access to the container. They can and they push it from their double click interface, so it's in the interface that they're used to. But it's been a couple of years since I've used that, but I know it was really handy, because then they could push those tags, then I could go in and actually set all the logic up for, okay, this only needs to fire off on this page, because there were hundreds of double click tags. Which actually leads me to another thing I didn't cover, because I really don't use it too much, is if I go back to the workspace, one of the cool things that Tag Manager added not too long, well, it's been several years ago, I say not too long ago, is the ability to set things up with folders, which is really awesome. So you can actually, and really however you want to set those up is really up to you. I try to group things based off of what the tag's doing. So I might have my variables, tags, and triggers in the same folder that are interrelated. But one thing that we did is we actually separated all of the double-click floodlight tags into their own folder, so that way they were easier to find. I still recommend, though, coming up with a naming convention even within that. If you notice on a lot of like the variables and things, these are all the pre-built-in variables. But all the ones that I've created, I tried to add like a prefix to the front of it to make it easier to find whenever I'm looking in a long list of variables. And I did that because that was before they actually had folders. So if I wanted to find this data layer variable that I created, it was a lot easier to track it down. And that was even before I think they had where you could sort by type and things like that. So usually what I would do is I'd do the prefix of what the type of variable was, and then kind of what the key is. For example, on the data layers variables, I grab what the key is. Some of the other ones, it's describing what it's doing. So like this JavaScript variable, it's grabbing the hit timestamp with local offset. This one's getting the client ID, those type of things. And I do the same with my triggers and my tags. So this trigger is being fired off of an event. This one's being fired off of a link click. And then the tags as well. This is an HTML tag. This is a universal analytics tag.